Hey everybody, welcome to Monday. I'm gonna try something in my staged return to comments. Oh wow, this shadow is making a cheap look. Sunlight, it burns. But I'm gonna pre-record today and tomorrow. I'm gonna see how it goes. I'm neck deep in writing for a video game project right now. I'm writing about 20 pages a day, so that is dominating my psyche right now. If you want to know more about this stuff, help support this channel, become a monthly patron, patreon.com/LeannaK. Today we're going to talk about critical theory because I'm noticing this is coming up a lot, and specifically the issues of critical theory and video games. And I don't know why I haven't done this before. I think because I was loath to get into it because this is something that brings out the hate. It's one of these things where people feel very strongly that there is one definition for the whole thing, and if you get it wrong, then you're evil. And critical theory is the source of this idea that if you get it wrong, you're not just wrong, you are evil. Let me explain, okay? The origins of critical theory are undeniably partially Marxist. There is something called the Frankfurt School, which persisted in developing the ideological components of Marxism while claiming to eschew the economic elements of Marxism. And then they added a side of Freud and some Hegel. Am I saying that right? Hegel? I never know how to pronounce these things. This is the problem with being like a hood kid. You learn all these things, you read all these things, but how do I pronounce these things? They don't come up a lot. But there are two schools of thought right there that break down in disagreement. One is, the Frankfurt School's claim that it is possible to separate the economic components of Marxism from the ideological components of Marxism. And then there is the other, which, full disclosure, I subscribe to this idea that you cannot separate the economic elements of Marxism from the cultural elements of Marxism. They are inextricably intertwined. Marxism is primarily an economic theory, and the ideology serves the economic theory, not vice versa. There is very little new in Marxist ideological theory. He uses ideology to advocate for basically collective or state-controlled economies. Boom, end of story. That's where I come down on. I'm not saying that's the only way to view this. I'm just saying this is what I subscribe to. So once we hit that barrier, and we're going to treat both as equal for the purposes of this exercise, then you get to exactly what critical theory does. And this is where it breaks down again. The main difference between critical theory, philosophy, and more traditional theoretical philosophy is that traditional philosophy simply seeks to explain and understand. Critical theory inherently attempts to change structures. And so I maintain critical theory has a higher bar of proof because you're not just saying this is how things are for the sake of saying this is how things are. This is a way of understanding the world. Critical theory is basically going, this is bad, change it. Well, in order for that to work, you have to prove something is in fact bad. And this is the core of if you disagree with me, you're evil, right? Because critical theory sees all philosophical and artistic traditions through some lens of oppression and dominance. We get a little bit of Foucault in there for those following along at home for that sort of thing. Now, There are more complications to this. I want to pull up the resource I have right here is not as good as the one I read before. So there are pillars of critical theory done right. If you believe critical theory can be done right. Now, let me be fair to critical theory here, even though I'm not a fan. The goals of critical theory are laudable, okay? A critical theorist seeks to liberate humanity from all forms of slavery and oppression, which is why it's done so well in race-based civil rights movements. Obvious reasons right there, like obvious applications. The most effective applications of critical theory have been regarding the criminal justice system. Critical theory works when it correctly identifies an unjust system and suggests ways of changing it. Where critical theory breaks down is when they get a false positive on an injustice. Just because certain things lean towards one group in terms of preference does not necessarily mean that it is advantaging a particular group in terms of power. For instance, the fact that television is increasingly looking for a primary advertising demographic that is 30, 35 plus female instead of the traditional 18 to 24 male does not mean that women suddenly are dominant in society. All that means is they've identified women as having an amplifier effect, a multiplier effect in terms of advertising, in that what sort of dish detergent, laundry soap, brand of jeans even, but more those household products, cleaners, sanitizers, the name brands you buy every single day and don't really think about, those are far more influenced by the female head of the household. Why? Because the female head of the household still does the bulk of the housework. So obviously this does not mean that women have suddenly become titans of industry. If that were so, women would be equal to men in terms of domestic duties, because, the suggestion is they're both spending equal amounts of time at the office. Their jobs are equally important to both partners in a heterosexual relationship. You would not see the ongoing imbalances in that way. And this is the problem with critical theory applied to media. Media is an excellent reflection of culture. Media historically has been shown to be a very poor driver of culture. Media is very good at normalizing stuff that's already there. I should say mass media. Mass media is very good at normalizing stuff that's already there. That's why propaganda works. You see something on TV, you think it's basically normal. This is what certain groups have done to try to torque it. Don't trust the mainstream media. They're trying to denormalize mass communicated news. Because mass communications, mass media, TV especially. TV has a unique thing because it comes into people's homes at the same time and it's linear. Everybody gets the same story. Unlike films, some people watch movies in their house, but the traditional way of seeing a movie is going to a movie theater, right? So you're leaving your house. Different. Video games have multiple endings and player interaction. It doesn't normalize things the same way TV does. So first mistake is treating every form of media like it's the same. But the other is using media as a force for change, when in fact what media is good at is as a force for normalization. So this is very good at, say, making gay people more accepted in society. It ain't necessarily so great at pressuring lawmakers to change the laws so that gay marriage can actually be legislated into legality as opposed to being decided by the Supreme Court. There's a shining example of the difference because the legal system inherently deals with real power over people's lives. Critical theory is very appropriate. It is about power and dominance there. It is about an adversarial system, and a lot of the times it's winner take all. Same with politics, right? This idea that there need to be more people who are not white, straight, cisgender men, WSCMs. There's something to that. That makes sense. In media, though, market forces are actually the best driver of content. You pressure brands for certain things, or brands know consumers like certain things, therefore they put their money in media that reflects those certain things. You know, there's a reason that ABC is all in on shows like Blackish and Mixedish and Grownish. The Black upper middle class around Atlanta and Houston is booming. Black people have money now. Ditto for places like New York and LA and Chicago. But it's that Atlanta, Houston area. There's wealthy Black people there. So there is cause to have media that looks for their advertising dollars. And critical theory totally falls apart in that venue precisely because of its Marxist roots. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be used somewhat effectively. And this is where, see what I mean? This is hard. Okay. I'm trying to find the phrasing. But basically, critical theory, I'll go back to the other one, whatever. Critical theory traditionally needs certain things to function. And this is where things often fall flat in terms of critical theory. And unfortunately, certain critical theory elements get pushed on society at large, but especially video games, and it actually fails the sniff test of critical theory. And that is 3 parts. The theory must adequately explain the social problems that exist. The theory must offer practical solutions for how to respond to them. And the theory must abide by the norms of criticism established by the field. Now, in another place, it describes it slightly differently, and everybody has a different definition of critical theory. It basically has to be accurate, expansive, and normative, I believe the terms is, which basically it's got to accurately define what the problem is. It's got to offer a feasible, workable solution for what the problem is. And it's got to offer something that is essentially achievable as a normative. The rules have to be the same for everybody. And it's that first one and that last one, that the rules have to be the same for everybody and it accurately describes the problem, that critical theories, small t, fall apart within a critical theory, capital T, framework. Okay. For instance, only white people can be racist. Okay. That is a major thing you hear a lot in critical theory coming out of the systemic racism work of critical theory's legal wing, which stated, in America, the justice system is tilted towards white people at the disadvantaging of predominantly Black people, but also in some ways Latinas, Latin American people. That's accurate. That accurately describes what's going on in the American justice system. It does not accurately describe what's going on in the rest of the world, where, for instance, the Chinese are putting Uyghurs in internment camps and cracking down on Hong Kong protesters. That is not white people doing any of that. You've got all the sectarian violence in Africa. Granted, yes, there was apartheid, but that is not white people doing that to other people. That is non-white people doing it to non-white people. And there's all the strife in the Middle East with like Armenia and I can't even pronounce that state. I want to say Ahmadinejad, but that's an Iranian politician. But they're blowing each other up right now. Ongoing things between Turkey and Armenia, the Armenian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, all these things. So this idea that only white people can be racist does not accurately describe what's going on, violates the requirements for critical theory. And yet some critical theorists still continue to perpetuate these theories. The interesting thing about critical theory when it works properly, and the reason I don't think we need critical theory is that this particular checklist applies to everything in philosophy, right? It's this Descartesian blending of mathematics and philosophy where to check your work in math, you basically reverse the steps or do something else to see if your end result produces your original result. And if it doesn't, something's wrong. So same thing with any sort of philosophical theory or any sort of social theory. If you create a result where it's not the same rules for everyone, there is something wrong with your methodology. You have made a mistake somewhere. So that the rules have to be equal for everyone is not just an inherent requirement. It's also a check that you got the other two things right, that you correctly explained the problem, and you offered a solution that's actually workable, that's actually feasible. And this is where we get into video games. This idea that we should just nerf every female playable character so there's not anything even remotely traditionally sexy about them. Well, are we nerfing male characters so that there's nothing traditionally sexy about them? No. Liu Kang and Geralt of Rivia are still running around without shirts. Geralt in the Netflix series more than ever, right? And we've got Shao Kahn still being, deathly allergic to pants. Somebody that should be, you should just pants. You should just have pants Shao Kahn for some sort of finishing move. Like, that's his friendship. You force Shao Kahn to put on pants and he just like self-immolates or something like that. I don't know. But like, we're not applying the rules equally, right? What's appropriate for things for people to say and not say. This whole microaggression idea. Well, either microaggressions are a universal concept or they're not a valid theory, which means you can commit microaggressions against WSCMs, right? For instance, this is the one I use in my college lectures. A man brings a dish to a kid's bake sale and someone goes, "Oh, did you make that yourself?" And then he says, "Yeah." "Really? Really? You made that yourself? Nobody, your wife didn't help you? You made that all by yourself?" That is a fucking microaggression against a WSCM, okay? You're assuming he is inherently incapable of making Rice fucking Krispy squares because he's male. There's a shining example. So, properly applied, this theory can work. But when that's the theory, all it really is don't be a dick to people when you assume you make an ass out of you and me. My third grade bus driver, Frank, always used to say, when you point the finger, the other three fingers are pointing back at you. And of course, the other hood kids in the bus would be, "Okay, I'm going to do this now." "You, no fingers pointing back at me." And he kind of chuckled and, "Take your seat, kid." But it's that idea of whenever you point the finger at someone, for instance, I spent, this is a video for another time. I want to do this now so I can get to that. But the social media behavior of certain people, "You're a liar." Well, what evidence do you have that I'm lying? "I think you're lying." You're lying. All right, buddy, you just opened yourself up to the exact same treatment. all somebody has to say is that you're lying and that's it. You're branded a liar. Nobody wants to be subjected to that standard, so don't do it. If that's the way we actually policed online communities, 95% of problems would be solved. Because we'd recognize that calling someone a liar or a grifter or whatever without evidence is wrong, because it's the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would want done unto you. We don't need an entire critical theory framework for that. We already have that. And this is my issue with critical theory. The good parts of critical theory exist in a lot of ways all the way back to Aristotelian virtue ethics. A lot of Aristotle's work was racist and sexist because of the time, but the bare bones of certain ideas are, Randian philosophy. Objectivism holds up better than critical theory does in terms of what's new, just because of the rejection of altruism that happens in objectivism, that critical theory heavily relies on altruism. And I think that's the problem with it. Objectivism's wrecked now by objectivists in high-ranking places within, the Ayn Rand Institute. So in some ways that's a bad example, but we're just looking at the philosophies, right? Objectivism does not require altruism. Therefore, when someone does not behave altruistically, they do not violate an objectivist framework in that way. Critical theory requires altruism. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one. And that never works. And that's pretty much what Ayn Rand was saying. Give me a fucking break. That's stupid. Because philosophical altruism that critical theory borrows from heavily is not the idea of I'm going to be nice to you because I would want this if it was done to me. That's rational self-interest. Altruism in classical philosophy it is not moral to, for instance, stop a killer because his victim was going to be, for instance, your wife. You have to suffer some horrible personal tragedy so that someone else can thrive and prosper, for it to be classical philosophical altruism. The example is essentially you save a serial killer's wife because it's life. You save a serial killer's life because it is moral to save lives. Even though the serial killer is then going to go on and kill your wife. That's the idea. Now, of course, it's stupid because that means you're saying the serial killer's life is worth more than your wife's life. And that's exactly what Ayn Rand was fighting against with objectivism. She didn't do it in a perfect way, but she was basically using pre-existing frameworks because she was a woman in a very male-dominated, profoundly sexist field, trying to go, the only way traditional altruism works is if you're a misogynist and think your wife's life is worth less than some serial killers just because allegedly you happen to like your wife. Like it's nonsense, right? And that's the whole idea. What most people consider altruism, the idea that you do something that's temporarily hard for the greater good, is actually rational self-interest, because that selfless act eventually comes back to benefit you in, to compare the Canadian system to the American system, less gun violence, better general quality of life, healthcare, better health outcomes, cheaper healthcare because it's universal, all that stuff. Like, we don't treat paying taxes, paying slightly higher income taxes as an altruistic act because we get it back, right? We get it back in healthcare. We get it back in roads. We get it back in better public schools. We get it back in cheaper post-secondary education, so on and so forth. That's not altruism. That's rational self-interest. And the classical altruism that critical theory requires, that is I have to self-flagellate in the public square to show I am a comrade, Marxism, is precisely why people cannot stand it in video games. People have this anaphylaxis develop mentally where they're so sick of seeing people self-flagellate like that. I'm a WSCM. They don't even make it that joyous, but I'm a white, straight, cisgendered male, so I must pontificate at length at how bad me and my other white, straight, cisgendered men are to show that I am an ally. People are so put off by that now they're jumping at shadows when someone is just trying to be considerate while still voicing their opinion. And so we have a giant mess. We have a race to the bottom where people are now using critical theory that is as accurate, that passes the critical theory sniff test, as well as other stuff that's accepted as passing the critical theory sniff test. And they're creating these things where there is, for instance, there is an out of control opioid addiction epidemic in the United States, and the primary group of people who is affected by the opioid addiction epidemic are white people. Therefore, white people are an oppressed class. And it's the thing that misses is, no, it's not white people. Like, yes, you correctly identified that it's mostly white people. However, you're leaving out that it's poor white people. So you have accurately identified the problem, but not completely identified the problem. The issue there is poverty. They can't afford healthcare, not the color of their skin, right? But because critical theories have misidentified the problems, for instance, women with cleavage in video games is why women don't play video games. I'm setting this up because of the Mortal Kombat video I'm going to do later in the week. It is true that more men play AAA games than women. It is true that to appeal to men in the 90s and even into the 2000s, they put a lot of boobs in games. However, if you actually look at the period of the X-Bro, you know, all those first-person shooters, there actually aren't that many women, period, in first-person shooters. They're goddamn sausage parties, except for Halo, because, I mean, even the early Gears of War games, there was Anya, and there was Cortana in Halo, and that was pretty much it. Cortana looked freaking cool. But they were sausage parties because they were military, and women didn't serve on the front lines of the military almost anywhere back then. Therefore, right? So they falsely diagnosed the problem, and so they suggested something that, because they falsely diagnosed the problem, seemed to be a workable solution. Take the boobs out of games. But because they falsely diagnosed a problem, their solution didn't actually solve the problem. And then, was it the same rules for everybody? No, of course not. So that element, that critical theory paradigm regarding cleavage in video games, or like sexy women and all, it failed on every single pillar of critical theory. And yet it's still used as valid critical theory. The problem is, if we take out the subjectivity of critical theory, we're left with fairly decent pre-existing structures from traditional philosophy that work better. Because philosophy is not activism. You want to go off and be an activist, you go right ahead. You be a policy person. Philosophy is not policy. Philosophy is not... policy exists only in the consequentialist school of philosophy. You want to be a consequentialist, you go right ahead, but critical theory isn't consequentialist. It isn't about outcomes. It's about justice. It's an ideologically driven, essentially, well, it's Marxist, so it doesn't really fit anywhere. Because again, going back to the beginning, it is predominantly an economic model. So it combines idealism or virtue ethics with consequentialism in that it's all about where the money goes. This doesn't work in a system where by its nature, this isn't healthcare. This isn't government services. That is something at the end of the day, somebody is going to have to want to buy. It's inherently capitalist. So you have to think about it from a capitalist structure. And that's why it's strictly what analysis like I do should identify problems first and foremost and workshop the crap out of identifying those problems. And then and only then suggest changes, which is what I do in my college lectures. It's basically, long story short, I showed that it's not actually the boobs in games that are the problem. It's actually, based on research, sex-typical women actually prefer certain types of gameplay to other types of gameplay. And games like the Fallout franchise actually have those types of gameplay in it more than, say, Tomb Raider. So you can put a female playable character on the box all you want. If those types of gameplay that women prefer aren't there, well, they're not going to play your game no matter how politically correct your heroine is, right? Everybody's going, yeah, okay, that makes complete sense. That fits all. You identify the problem correctly. You offer a workable solution, which is put in the types of gameplay that women want if you want women to play your game. And then it's the same rules for everybody, right? Like, it's types of gameplay. It's not men can't do certain things, women can't do. No, it's equal opportunity for all, right? That actually fits the critical theory checklist better. But it was created using an intersectionalist framework, but that element of intersectionalist framework pre-existed critical theory because it goes back to the smallest minority is a minority of one. Individualism is the most important thing. We just have to mass measure individualism, right? And this is where philosophy fares very poorly in terms of big data analysis. And that's something for another time. But do you see the point? For those of you who are fans of critical theory, that's all well and good. I don't think it's necessary, but if you like it, make sure you're actually following your own damn rules and create a critical theory that is in the framework that critical theory sets out. It must fulfill those three roles. And you don't just get to say, I feel it does, because that's not actually rigid critical theory. That's just straight up postmodernism, deconstructionism, right? When it's just, I feel that it is. No, that is not critical anything. That is just a feeling. Okay? So this is going to build on the next two videos I do. If you like this sort of stuff, because it's very heady and critical theory, not going to get a ton of hits on YouTube. Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com/LeannaK. Thanks for watching.